Normally with the live stream, you'll want to start it like 5 or 10 minutes early. Because
it doesn't work half the time.
Because half the time it doesn't work.
With the first event, we sat there for like 30 minutes and it wouldn't connect. And then they were like, 5 minutes, and then we took a new iPad and it still didn't work. And all we did was we started.
Go there and they like logic or something.
And in the next 2 weeks, we'll hear back from the publisher, and we're hopeful that we can get a contract for both of them. Me and Steve Marc, we just
that's what I was told.
It's a fairly short deadline. So I can share something. It'll be about dark times and supertext and changing. The goal is to get it out in July 1st next year. It'll be like a textbook actually.
This is what my hell looks like. It has shrimp and spreadsheet.
Welcome to our hell.
Where am I going?
Gas stations have a very
Not getting a gas station. I said think about like getting gas station.
I've got a channel. Do I have it? I don't know.
Do you deliver?
No.
Yeah, in my car.
I've said it before on stage when Culver's needs to deliver.
Oh my god. I already had Culver's this week.
Yeah, but Culver's needs to deliver. If Culver's delivered, I would be so much fatter than I am now. And I'm already like
Online
slightly squishy.
When I can order online and then go to the
Probably.
I can have my car so I can control this one.
I'll put my faculty hat on for a second. We have plenty of seats in the front. And we pay more for the people that sit in the front, except for Tim Light. So please feel free to come on down. And then there's some along the edges. We're going to get started any minute.
This is what I use the faculty hat.
Good afternoon all. Thank you for all being here today. So we really appreciate your attendance and participation. I also want to welcome those who are watching this event via the Ripon College Live Events YouTube channel. I'm Ali Hamza, President of the Amnesty International Club at Ripon College. So it's my honor to introduce today's event. So today's panel, Racial Disparities in the U.S. Judicial System, is sponsored by Amnesty International Club Ripon College, the Pre-Law Society, and the Center for Politics and People. So the panel will explore how there is a need to take ascending steps to eradicate the racial disparities embedded in the U.S. judicial system. So to discuss these issues, we are lucky to have four distinguished guests with us: Honorable Judge Carl Ashley, Professor Steve Sorensen, Kate Griffith, and Professor Marc Eaton. So our first panelist, Carl Ashley, is a judge for the Milwaukee County Circuit Court, Branch 33 in Wisconsin. In 1999, he was the first African American judge to be elected directly by the voters in a state without receiving a good neutral appointment. Ashley earned his BS from Marquette University in 1979. He earned his Judicial Doctorate from Marquette University School of Law in 1983. In 1978 to 1980, he was a commercial underwriter and then kept exploring different professions inside the legal field. And then he became, in 1999, the judge, and even like right now, he's the judge at Milwaukee County Circuit Court. The State Bar of Wisconsin selected Ashley as the 2011 Judge of the Year. In 2013, Ashley received the Leaders in the Law Award from Wisconsin Law Journal. In 2014 and 2015, Ashley was presented with the State Bar President's Award. Our second panelist, Kate Griffith, is a teacher of Spanish, reading and social studies at Ripon High School and Lowman Charter High School. She has taught a number of seminars on the race and immigration in the U.S. and has been a frequent speaker and writer on these topics for local organizations and publications. She was acting in the comprehensive county-wide diversity initiative of Fond du Lac County, which brought together area colleges, businesses, and others to address racial inequalities and improve the climate of Fox Valley for racial, cultural, and other minorities. She is the author of a chapter about teaching Latinx students in the book, White Women Getting Real About Race. She has the degrees in public policy from the University of Chicago, agricultural economics for UW-Madison, and educational leadership from UW-Oshkosh. Our third panelist, Professor Marc Eaton, is an associate professor of sociology and chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Ripon College. He received his PhD in 2011 from the University of Colorado Boulder, where he studied the growth of online activism by examining the strategy, tactics, and rhetoric of MoveOn.org. His research has been published in several academic journals and in a co-edited volume he completed in 2018 with Dennis Reshko, Sociology, Minnesota State University, Mankato, entitled The Supernatural in Society, Culture, and History. Over his 15 years of teaching, Professor Eaton has explored the topic of racial disparities in the criminal justice system in multiple classes, most notably his social problems and deviances courses. As an advisor of Ripon College's minor in criminal justice, he has worked with many students who wish to pursue careers in criminal justice and has tried to instill in them a critical awareness of the racial disparities in stops, arrests, convictions, and sentencing. So, for today's panel, the moderator will be Professor Sorensen, adjunct professor of politics and government, and Peer Law advisor at Ripon College. So, Steve Sorensen is widely known attorney who provides counsel on corporate law and estate planning. He also represents municipalities, and with this regard to real estate, and he counsels on land use, zoning, smart growth, waterfront litigation, and non-metallic mining. Steve Sorensen has served in many capacities with the State Bar of Wisconsin, including terms as president and secretary, as well as chairing several of their standing committees. We are fortunate that Stephen Sorensen is an adjunct professor of politics and government and business and Peer Law advisor at Ripon College. Steve is a frequent lecturer on legal ethics, real estate law, and waterfront rights, and he's a fellow of both the Wisconsin Law Foundation and the American Bar Foundation. After the talk, we will have the time for questions for the audience. Let's welcome Professor Steve Sorensen, Honorable Judge Carl Ashley, Professor Marc Eaton, and Kate Griffith. So now Professor Steve Sorensen will take over as a moderator to moderate the conversation. So now welcome Professor Steve Sorensen.
Thank you very much, Ali. It'll improve your grades tomorrow in class. We've been planning this for quite a long period of time, and I think there were times that Ali thought I was never going to give him the names of the mystery people that would be good. But I think the reality of today's program is you're going to have an extremely diverse presentation, but you're also going to have the ability to hear from what I consider three different perspectives that are really, I think, unique on the issue of diversity in the judiciary. The four of us that are up here come from different perspectives in many, many ways. And I think that that's part of the real issue that's out there and part of the discussion that makes judicial diversity and inequities so important and sometimes so hard to understand. So I think you're going to get perspectives. Now what we'd like to do, and we're going to open this up, is we're going to have each of the panelists kind of make an introductory comment on what they believe are the circumstances, historical, societal, that create the what should we say, inequities in the judicial system that are predicated upon diversity. And then we're going to go look at some very specific questions and very specific issues. And finally, we're going to open it up to all of you, and we're going to ask each and every one of you. And I promised Ali and Professor Schatzinger that if you don't ask questions, those of you that I know that are in the audience, I will call on you and ask you to ask a question, or I will ask you a question. And Judge Ashton knows that I will do that. So I know that the panel talked about who should go first, and we thought it was extremely appropriate that we should do it based on looks. And Carl adjusted his tie 3 times, so Kay is going to go first. And so Kay, would you just kind of give us your philosophy of this issue of judicial diversity and where you see it coming from?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for organizing this, and Ali for being a wonderful correspondent throughout the whole process of leading up to it. I'm very honored to be with both of you, all of you. Yeah, I'm going to start actually by going way back in history. One of the things that got me interested in this subject. I want to make a point that seems really, really obvious, but it's easy to forget it, which is that our system is based on respect for tradition, respect for what has come before. We believe in consistency. We believe in the steady accretion of knowledge and judicial wisdom, which means that we rely on the precedents of decisions that have been made before. And I think there's a lot to recommend this. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, incorporating insights from the past into today's circumstances. I think it's probably prevented us a certain amount of capriciousness in decision making. The problem is that a lot of the founders of our legal system were unabashedly racist. They were unabashed white supremacists. Now that is a really strong term, and I'm gonna ask you to be patient with me till I explain that. But the precedents that they set have set us on the course of ongoing racial oppression. Because of our deference to prior decisions in current jurisprudence, the biases and prejudices of the early practitioners ended up becoming enshrined in law. So these prejudices shape our decision making today because we have to defer to them. So we can go all the way back to the Doctrine of Discovery, which is the doctrine that the popes first espoused in the 1400s. That doctrine was what gave Europeans permission to explore and settle and expropriate people from their land all over the world. It gave them explicit permission to subjugate, enslave, kill, Christianize, pretty much whatever they wanted to do to the people that they met around the world and to colonize them. That doctrine is still the basis of law in our country today. As recently as 2005, Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote a decision based on that law, finding against the Oneida Nation. So it's not dead, it's not gone. I'd like to share a few quotes that kind of give a sense of how that's played out, because I think it really gets at the question of how did we wind up with this incredibly racist seeming system when it wasn't necessarily the intentions of anybody alive today that it be that. I want to go back to, well, Johnson versus McIntosh in 1823. It was, he was the Chief Justice, William Marshall. What he said was, the religion and character of American Indians afforded an apology for considering them as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim an ascendancy. That was our Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1823. In 1831, in the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, a judge said, the Indians are in a state of pupillage. Their relation to the U.S. resembles that of a ward to his guardian. Theodore Roosevelt, 1900. The settler and pioneer have at bottom had justice on their side. This great continent could not have been kept as nothing but a game preserve for squalid savages. We come back to, and then all the way up to a lot more recently, Chief Justice William Rehnquist in 1978 in Oliphant versus Suquamish Indian Tribe. That decision was to not allow tribal courts to try white people for crimes that were committed on tribal lands. He basically said, nope, Indian courts can't do that. Only white courts can do that. I hear echoes of what William Marshall said. He referred to the laws that were undergirding the law at that time. He referred to it as the courts of the conqueror. I hear echoes of the courts of the conqueror in Rehnquist's decision. And Rehnquist proceeded to rule against Indian tribes 88% of the time. So that's not so long ago. So just to give you a sense, starting with the 1400s, coming all the way up to pretty much the present, we have this foundation based on the idea that Native American people are inferior to white people, and we have not overturned these precedents. These precedents are alive today.
So the doctrine of discovery certainly has a basis in some of the diversity issues that rise in the courts today. But obviously there's more than just the doctrine of discovery that creates racial diversion within our court system. I will turn now to Judge Ashley, who sees racial diversity on a daily basis as a circuit court judge in Milwaukee County. How would you view the situation?
Well, first I want to thank Ollie, and I want to thank Steve for the opportunity to come here. You know, guys, I'm driving up here from Milwaukee, getting out of court, and my clerk is like, "You gotta go," and I'm like, "Okay, right." So I drive here, and I'm driving up here. I wanted to make sure that I thank you for coming to this event. It says something about you that you wanted to come here. You might have some nefarious reasons, but generally speaking, you're coming here to learn. Maybe your bride or some other reason. But I think it's important that we take every opportunity to educate each other about the historical aspects of diversity and lack thereof, racism, slavery. But I want to move forward too. So I will diverge every once in a while, and although we're taking historical perspectives, I certainly want you to walk out of here with things that are relevant to today as it relates to your efforts. Each of you have the ability to assist better outcomes and more diversity. Because sometimes you can sit in a room and you'll hear something, and you'll sit over there and go, "Wow, that's kind of racist." But should I say something? I don't want them to look at me or feel like I'm out in left field. So I'll just sit here and feel uncomfortable. Don't necessarily agree with it, but I'm not comfortable raising the issue. So I want to give you that little push throughout the presentation today. You'll learn a lot. But the question is, how is that going to affect what you do when you leave here? Are you going to be more involved and have the courage to say something or do something? Because if you don't, who will? And if not now, when will you step up and say something? And don't get me wrong, even with my colleagues, we have discussions amongst ourselves. Can't have anybody in there either. Talking about issues. And when people talk about race, implicit bias, people get nervous. Are you calling me a racist because you mentioned the word implicit bias? My God, what are we coming to? I want you to realize in order to have meaningful discussions, it's not always going to be comfortable. Some sort of empowering, right?
Yeah.
Yes. All right, so historic, and there was the mention of some of the trappings, the historical trappings of where we are. It goes back. I'm going to talk about the 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, made slavery and involuntary servitude unconstitutional in the United States, except as punishment for crime. As the end of slavery left a void in Southern labor markets, the criminal justice system became one of the primary means of continuing the legalized involuntary servitude of African Americans. Initially, states passed discriminatory laws to arrest and imprison large numbers of black folks, then leased them as prisoners to private individuals and corporations in a system of convict leasing that resulted in a dangerous condition, abuse, death, while states profited and earned money, and the prisoners, of course, they didn't get paid. Work conditions were serious, deadly, hazardous. Thousands of people of color were forced into brutal systems that historians have called worse than slavery. And that's after you're free. Okay? So there'll be more, and I'll come back.
Thank you. Let's take that whole issue of criminality and the use of the criminal justice system. I know, Mark, that's one of your big areas, and you bring an interesting perspective, both from an ethical perspective as well as looking at the judicial system from a criminal perspective. How would you view this issue as we're presenting it today?
Yeah, thank you very much, Steve, and thank you, Ali, as well, for helping to organize this. And so I think I'll just sort of build off some of the historical context here. Of course, we're talking about slavery, the roots of racism in our country. You can't really understand American history without understanding racism. It is at the core of what the founders of our nation, how they viewed the world. But beyond that, I was going to move forward a little bit in time beyond, say, the 1600s, the 1800s, to talk more about, I guess, the recent historical context for some of the things that led us to where we are today. So, for example, post-Civil War, post-emancipation, even post-Reconstruction, we're left in a situation where the country as a whole is divided, is legally segregated or segregated de facto. In terms of housing, educational opportunities, job opportunities, you name it. And so as we enter into the 20th century, we have issues such as redlining, for example, in poor communities, and poor communities, for historically racist reasons, are disproportionately full of people of color who were not given appropriate education, appropriate job opportunities, these sorts of things. And so as the urban communities are being redlined and denied housing loans, the white middle-class communities post-World War II are being provided housing loans to suburbanize, to flee the inner cities, leaving them poor and bereft of the money that would then flow from these middle-class families that was now being spent on the fringes of the city and the new malls and so forth. So as you go from the 50s into the 60s and into the 70s, the situation gets worse in the sense that you have a poor inner city population that is at least somewhat self-sufficient because they tend to have manual labor jobs, and many of those jobs are unionized. Into the 70s, of course, the unions start to break apart, jobs start to go overseas, so you get this post-industrial sort of wasteland, I guess you could say, in the centers of the cities, where perhaps by no surprise, illicit markets in drugs, gang activity, sort of fills the void that's left in this jobless environment, again, for historical reasons, that is more likely to be full of people of color. And so that is kind of the stew, I guess you could say, that provides some context for some of the things that we're looking at here today. Of course, as many of you in the education program know, or maybe just people who are paying attention to these things, with the structure of educational funding in our cities, you also have a large proportion of the funding, I'm sure, Kat, you can speak to this as well, for schools coming from property taxes. And so if you have poor urban environments where houses aren't worth that much, or people don't even own homes, they just rent, the property taxes in those neighborhoods are pretty low, and as a result, the schools are also underfunded. And so you wind up with a cyclical process where, for historical reasons, going back to the 1400s, 1600s, the 1800s, and beyond, we live in a current historical moment shaped by segregation, deindustrialization, concentrated urban poverty among communities of color, who don't really have financial means, don't have the educational training to necessarily always be able to carve themselves out and get themselves out of the neighborhoods. As a result, you're left trying to make a living off of what is available in the neighborhood, which is, criminal activities of one sort or another. Not to paint with a super broad brush here, of course, there's many people living in these environments who are not involved in any criminal activity. But you're set up in a situation where you're surrounded by violence, you're surrounded by crime, and you don't feel a sense of opportunity, a sense of hope, and you don't feel as though you have the tools necessary to get yourself out of that situation. And so all of that creates a scenario where we're left in a situation where when police enter those environments, they're more likely to find concentrated, poor communities of color, and I'm sure we'll continue with some of the things to do with sentencing and all of that, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, and you raise an interesting issue, and I think this is where we want to take this, because we're trying to talk today about what the role of the judiciary and what the role of the justice system and what the role of the legal system is in perpetuating what we see as a lack of diversity. But we have a supposition, and I think I want to talk about that supposition for a second. And that supposition is that diversity is good, and that segregation is bad. That's a supposition that is on the table, and it certainly is part of the educational environment. We take that, and yet we see a legal system, as Kay pointed out, as the judge pointed out, that doesn't seem to recognize that when it gets to writing laws and making judicial decisions, even though probably the most educated people who serve as lawyers and who serve as judges would talk the talk, but they work with a set of laws, they work with a set of rules. Do you see this as a systemic problem, Judge Ashley?
First of all, I love my fellow panelists to educate me. I always learn when I come to one of these things. Look, I think, Steve, what you're talking about is, first of all, it's the criminal justice system that's a big part, but it's social economic that really propels all of this. I worked out at children's court, and as a young lawyer out of children's court, I came there and there were people who had issues with their children, abuse or neglect. And I had a chance to learn because when I was in law school, I was in the DA's office as an intern. And so I went there and I was prosecuting cases as an intern and was looking forward to the opportunity to be in a DA's office. So when I graduated, I went to E. Michael McCann, who had been in that position forever. Now it's John Chisholm, who's a great guy. And I said, can I have a job? And he said, sure, but it'll be about a month. And my wife said, no, you need to go to work. So the public defender offered me a job that Monday after graduation. So guess where I was? I was in the public defender's office. And my mother said, oh my God, I can't believe you're helping those criminals. And I want you to know that was probably one of the most important things that happened to me as a person. We have those things that happen in your life that kind of turn or make a significant detour where you thought you were going. Because now I wasn't representing the government or the community. I started representing people one-on-one. And when I went back there and I saw people who had allegedly abused their kids, I showed them the loop marks on the back from the extension cord. And I took the pictures because we used to get them in those days, and I took them over and I said to my client, do you see this? And she looked at it and said, I didn't do that. And I said, well, I think I just did what happened to me when I grew up. That was the way I was raised. If I did something wrong, my parent would take the extension cord and discipline me. Isn't that the way? And then you realize the disconnect. Learn behavior. And how do we break that cycle? In the criminal arena, some of the same things. One of the things I've been a judge for over 21 years. And one of the things I've learned, and my colleagues and I get together, I heard the comment at our meetings that there's a funnel. And I'm a judge, and I'm on the bottom of the funnel. I don't bring the people in. I don't do this. I'm just in there calling balls and strikes That's my job. And I used to think, well, there's some truth to that. We don't prosecute people. We don't go and arrest people. We get what comes in front of us. But the question for my colleagues that I said, well, what can we do more systemically to help the community understand the dilemma? And I think we're doing a lot more of that. So Steve, when you talk about what can we do to help with the system, I think we're a little more proactive. We take on a little bit more ownership. Not all my colleagues. But we're coming to the point where we realize we can't use the prison system to correct these ills. It doesn't work. Financially, it doesn't work. I've sent a lot of people to prison. I've sent some with no opportunity for parole, homicide cases. And I used to say that kind of offhandedly. But now when we talk about trauma and being trauma-informed, now my question is, what caused that defendant to do that? What kind of life must they have had to do something as heinous, where I have to send them to prison with no opportunity for parole? And that's the bigger issue. And that's what our system is trying to do now, is realize we are at the bottom of that funnel. But systemically, there's a lot more we can do to address and like this, talk about this, because I'm sure my panelists here will talk more about those other underpinnings. But it's not about just what happens in the courtroom. I have more to say about that, but I'm going to let you pass this on.
Yeah, I think, Kay, I'd like to turn to you real quickly, because you see this as a tremendously systemic problem as our culture and as part of our stare decisis, which is embedded in our judicial system, where we do rely on case law, we do rely on the history of the case law, but how do we escape that rule of law that we've kept this country together with for over 200 years?
Yeah, so a couple things I'd like to say about that. One is that there's one thing that's happened recently, which, although it's a cause for genuine despair on the part of many of us, I also see seeds of hope in it, which is the opioid crisis. I know that sounds a very strange thing to say. I see seeds of hope in that. But the hope that I see is that the opioid crisis is being treated so differently than the crack crisis. The crack crisis was seen as a black problem. It was seen as violent black people who are doing this drug, who need to be locked up and kept away and kept from doing any more damage. There's some things to say about that. How many of you hold up fingers? I'm going to multiply whatever fingers you hold up by 10 to show what percentage of crack users do you think were black? So if you hold up 5 fingers, that'd be 50%. If you hold up 8 fingers, 80%. Hold up your fingers. Okay, I'm seeing, I would say maybe an average of about 5 or 6. So it turns out that 66% of crack users were white. We thought of this as a black drug. 80% of the people who were sentenced for the use of crack were black. They were a relatively small minority of the actual users. What's happened with the opioid crisis is that it's being seen as an everybody problem. It very obviously affects all kinds of people. White people, probably including white crack users, never saw the devastation that was visited on black communities during the crack epidemic. They never saw what was done to families and communities and neighborhoods when so many people were locked up. People are getting the opioid crisis. They see what's happening, and they feel compassion. Now that so many people know somebody who's been touched by this. I have a former student who's a heroin addict. I saw her the other day. Breaks my heart. I don't want to lock her up. I remember talking to our school liaison officer about her, and he said, I'm not going to arrest her unless there's a treatment bed. And there never was a treatment bed. That was enlightened policing to my mind. If you got a solution for her, then you take her off the streets. If you don't, maybe not. So what I see is that the opioid epidemic has elicited a level of compassion and awareness, a deeper questioning of what caused this and what can we do about it, a tendency to think in terms of how can we solve the problem of these broken people, how can we treat these people, rather than how can we lock them up. I'm not saying that jail is never appropriate. Sometimes it is. Sometimes you have to make society safe from certain people. But that can't be the main, or shouldn't be the main response. And a treatment response doesn't have the devastating collateral effects that an incarceration response does. So we're not getting with the program fast enough with the opioid epidemic, but I see the way we're approaching it is changing quite a bit, and that does give me hope. And I think it shows what could be the beginnings of a systemic change in the way we think about incarceration for drugs generally, and that would be really helpful, because if we look at the history of incarceration, drug-related incarceration, it is overwhelmingly a Black phenomenon. I've got about 18 pages of statistics here I can share with you, but this is turning out to be a little bit of a change. I hope we get to some of this evidence, though, about the systemic nature of the racial bias in our drug system.
Marc, one of the things that, I hope you don't mind me using your first name.
No.
I already asked the judge permission, because he could do something to me if I do it wrong.
Go with that. Good.
Marc, I look at this, there's a suggestion out there that we really need to take our judicial system and we need to break it into the quadrants, that the people that are judging the people are the people that are part of the quadrant where that's the problem. Picking off of the opiate problem, those seem to be people who are in a higher economic society, so maybe they should be the ones judging. People that are involved in heroin, maybe are in a lower economic, or I mean, again, I'm not trying to label this, I'm suggesting you're a person who looks at this from a sociological, anthropological, and ethical point of view. So do you think that there's a stratification as a way of dealing with this systemic problem?
That's the idea of it, I think, is probably well-meaning in some way, in the sense that if we're going back to this idea that justice is blind, or you'll be judged by a jury of your peers, these sorts of things that we say, then the question is, okay, well, who are your peers, right? I think we already have a stratified system, though, in the sense that people who are poor tend to be at the bottom of the system and tend to not receive the same level of, say, personalized care, I guess, when it comes to, say, the public defender experience versus having a multi-million-dollar lawyer on hand to defend you in any given case. And then, of course, people who do have the opportunity, the economic opportunity, regardless of their skin color or any other aspects of their being, who maybe have an easier time navigating the system effectively in such a way that they don't wind up with a record. Whereas people on the lower end that don't have the ability to, say, even pay their way out of jail, they're just stuck in there because they can't pay the bond, are much more likely to take a plea deal, wind up with a criminal record, and therefore be on the radar excuse me, for the next time that they're stopped. So I don't necessarily think that the answer would be to stratify it by the type of crime or the type of person who's alleged to have committed the crime. I think there are things wrong with the way the system works. I think that, this idea, the idea that justice is blind, I think in many ways echoes what we call color blindness, right? This idea that as a society, the goal should be that we don't see color, that we judge the content of the character, not the color of the skin, as Martin Luther King famously said. But going back to what Kat said earlier, that's simply not the reality of the basis of our system. It never has been. So, when I was thinking about some of these questions about steps that could be taken, one of the things that I wrote down is that shifting, I guess one of the solutions I could see, rather than segregating it and stratifying it, would be to shift from a kind of colorblind ideology. It's this, I thought of it almost as a kind of inverted myth of meritocracy. The myth of meritocracy, of course, is this idea that everybody has equal opportunity, you can lift yourself up by your bootstraps, and through hard work and determination, anyone can achieve anything, right? It's a sort of inverted version of that we have in the criminal justice system that says, if you did the crime, you do the time, right? Like, you've earned your way into this situation, and justice is blind, you will get what you deserve, regardless of any other aspects of your being. However, we know from statistics on crack cocaine versus powder cocaine sentencing in the 80s and beyond into today, that disproportionately people of color are served longer sentences, put away for good, policed more often, these sorts of things. And so I was thinking that rather than doing anything such as a stratified system, we would need what I guess I call a color-aware approach, and I'm not sure that that's a catchy term, but instead of being colorblind, right, to be color-aware. So looking, for example, at the Sentencing Project's recent report to the UN on racial disparities in the US criminal justice system, one of the things that they talk about is doing a racial impact assessment on all aspects of the criminal justice system: stops, searches, detainments, arrests, convictions, sentencing. And also, I think one of the things that Kat mentioned, the post-incarceration collateral consequences of having a record, of therefore not getting access to federal student loans, federal housing assistance, in some cases food stamps, having to report that on a job application and therefore winding up at the bottom of the pile again and again and again. Essentially setting ourselves up for people who have felony convictions to almost be guaranteed to wind up back in a situation where they're tempted at least to commit another crime simply to put food on the table. So the idea then would be not so much to change the structure of the system, but to make the system more self-reflective and to really seriously assess how, through nobody's specific fault and through no one in the system being openly racist, let's say, systems can nonetheless produce racist consequences because of the way that policies are written, because of the historical context and the precedent that Kat had mentioned earlier. So I think if we were serious about recognizing that justice isn't blind, then we could maybe start to think about structural problems, which then of course is the step to thinking about structural solutions.
Recently, the American Bar Association study that many people are criticizing, but it came out to indicate that racial disparity is not the issue, economic disparity is the issue, and when we quit thinking about it as a racial issue and start thinking about it as a socio-economic issue, that's when we'll finally become, shall we say, justice is blind. What do you think, Judge?
I'll tell you one thing, there's a couple of things, Kate and Professor said that this resonated with me. Justice is blind. I have to tell you, when I was a young defense attorney, I had a client, he was African American, and I had a judge who I had great respect for. And I remember telling my client as we went in, because he said, "What's this judge like?" Attorney asked me, "What's this judge like?" And I said, "This judge is colorblind. You don't see color." And when I said that was about 30 years ago, okay. When I said it then, I was saying what I thought was a positive reflection of that judge, okay? Come full circle, that's the craziest thing. Because unless he's really colorblind, he does see color, okay? So, and what's been mentioned here is to recognize that. I mean, just the thought of that you're colorblind, and I don't know that you're black. I don't know all those things that you're just like a white guy. So I just think that whole concept, so when I hear colorblind and I go, it just freaks me out. Because I think as a system, we understand that now. I think my colleagues have a better understanding that if you say you're colorblind, you got a problem. Okay? You got a problem. Maybe glasses, I don't know what. And the second thing was, you talked about the cocaine issue. One of the things I want to go back. As part of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, Congress ignored empirical evidence that would indicate there's no difference between crack and powder. I mean, cocaine, there isn't. It's simply two forms of the same drug. But still, they made it 100-to-1 for the penalty. And who did it affect? People of color. And here's another thing. We talk about drug treatment and programming now. And I've been a drug treatment judge several different times. I just left there and rotated out. And I have to tell you, people of color often say to me, "Hey, you know what? Now that, more white folks are getting involved in the issue of opioid issues, it is a health problem." But when it was blacks, they're criminals. And I tell them I can't change the past, and that's why I keep leaving you with the message. I'd like to change history, but we can't. But we ought to understand how we reflect on the way people were treated. And now we see it as and that's why I'm encouraged as well, that there's an opportunity that people can see that and maybe reflect back on how people, whole segment of our society, was traumatized, imprisoned at a significantly higher rate, all because, well, what do you think that motive was? I'll let that go. So as we talk, and Steve, I kind of get on these tangents because some of these things resonate with me about how we have to do things differently. And I think there's potential for that to happen out of this. Because now people think drug problems affect everybody, socioeconomic. You talked about economics and race. Well, let me tell you, it's both. It's both. There's a racist aspect to this, and it's also economic, but they feed on each other. For example, when blacks in the late 1900s, early 1900s, that period of time, wanted to buy a home, they couldn't get a home. How did people build value? It was in their homes. People got a home when they died, the kids got a home, they built on that resources and value. And blacks were denied that. Mm-hmm. They were denied that opportunity. And some of those issues still exist, significantly so.
Yeah, the question comes, and again, I want to keep this dialogue because I think this is an important dialogue, is that the problem is growing up in the sense that it's not pure race, it's not pure economics, it's a mixture. I'm going to throw one at you, Kate, that I think you're going to pick up and run with, or you'll ignore and finish what you wanted to say, which is okay. I've been a moderator a long time. That's culture. Because one of the things I think when you talked about it earlier, this doctrine of discovery, is a huge aspect of our life. We all grow up in different cultures. And by the time we become students at the university or the college here, we've got this culture ingrained in us that certainly formulates a lot of our beliefs. And I think that culture gets into synthetic drugs, and expensive drugs are okay for certain people. They're not okay for other people. I mean, it's okay to snort coke in Hollywood, or if you're a professional athlete making a lot of money, but if you're doing it on the street corner in inner city Milwaukee or Chicago, it's not okay. So I'm not going to take away your topic that you wanted to discuss, but I do want you to come back to culture because I really think you understand that issue.
Okay, I will start there. I'm going to challenge your use of the word culture a little bit, or twist it around a little bit. I'm going to talk about implicit bias. I think that a lot of the culture of growing up white in this country, and I definitely include myself very much in that, is growing up with a very good chance of having an implicit bias against race people. And I will make against black people, excuse me. I will make a confession here, which is that the first time I took the race implicit associations test, I don't know if you know this, raise your hand if you've heard of it.
How many did you take it?
How many of you, okay, so about half of you, maybe a little less than half. So this is a test you can take online. Look up race IAT, implicit associations test. There's all sorts of them. It measures your response time to see whether you have an implicit negative association with black people or white people or other, there's other tests you can take as well. Now the first time I did this, I was very, very distressed and ashamed to find that I had a moderate negative bias against black people. You know, it was in the air I breathed. It was in my mother's breast milk. It was everywhere. I don't know that I could have avoided that very easily where I grew up, which was an absolutely all-white town with the exception of one kid down the street from me. So, how do you deal with that? That implicit bias was not something that I consciously accepted. It was not something that I consciously wanted or approved of. On the contrary, I was very ashamed of that. But there it was. So, that I learned over time drove my behavior in ways that I did not want it to drive my behavior. I did things that, God, did I say that? did I just do that? And I wanted so badly not to be that person, but I was that person. And it drove my behavior in ways that shocked me and distressed me. And I finally had to kind of come clean with myself about how, okay, these subconscious thoughts, which I don't approve of, are still driving my behavior. And they are still driving the behavior of a great part of our criminal justice system, okay? I think most white people are in this boat. 80% of the people who have taken the race IAT, and there are millions of people who've taken it, have a negative bias against black people. 50% of the black people who've taken it have a negative bias against black people, okay? This is not good news for many of us, but you can start there. Okay, so what do I do about that? So the way that we have to change this culture is to make it visible, make it conscious, and then start to challenge our unconscious. That's a little harder to do than you might think. You can't just exhort yourself to, stop being racist, cat. Down, don't do that. You have to re-educate your subconscious, which is kind of a subtle task. And for me, this involved reading an enormous amount. It involved seeing movies. It involved going to workshops. I've participated in about 55 days of diversity events. This has remade me, okay? When I take that test now, I don't come out like that. But it took a while. It was about a 10-year process for me. So I think that's the culture that we've grown up in and the culture that we need to challenge and to change. And now I'm going to do the piece I wanted to do that you didn't want me to do. I would like to say a little bit more about crack versus powder cocaine, because I'm not sure if everybody's aware of this really compelling piece of evidence and compelling damage that has been done. So when that sentencing commission came along, they made the penalties for crack cocaine 100 times higher than for powder cocaine, because crack cocaine at the time was being seen as the scourge of inner city black communities associated with all kinds of violence and perhaps more addictive or problematical than powder cocaine. Studies showed that those things actually weren't true, but if you think about it, 5 grams of crack, that is about the weight of 2 pennies, 5 grams of crack got the same penalty as 500 grams of powder cocaine. So you had people who were individual users, kids, who could be locked up for 5 years on their first offense for that one thing. 66% of the crack users were white, but they were only 8% of the federal criminal defendants. So most of the white people were getting away with it. Most of the black people were not. Fewer than 20% of the crack users were black, but they were more than 80% of the defendants in the federal system. This was devastating. Now let's get into the sentencing. In 1986, before this mandatory minimum sentencing for crack thing went through, the average federal drug sentence for African Americans was 11% higher than the sentence for white people of the same crime. So that's a significant difference. It's not overwhelming. 4 years later, the average federal drug sentence for African Americans was 49% higher. That's a lot. When you're talking about years of somebody's life, it's half again as much, okay? And the goal of targeting high-level offenders failed. This was supposed to be catching, the kingpins. Kingpins don't have 5 grams of crack. 73% of the people who were crack offenders who went to jail were the couriers, the lookouts, the kids on the corner. They were the people who had no information for the prosecutor that he was interested in. They couldn't plea bargain for something different, and they had this minimum sentence. And they were the ones who were easy to catch. For police departments trying to show we're effective, we're strong, we're confronting this scourge in these communities. Rounding up these kids, putting them in prison for years was a way to say, hey, look what we're doing. The belief that crack users and dealers were often violent, not to say that there wasn't a lot of violence in these neighborhoods. There was. That was a real thing. And actually, a lot of African Americans supported this legislation because their neighborhoods were having such a hard time. It turned out that it was less related to the crack epidemic than a lot of people thought. 3/4 of crack offenders had no weapons involvement at all. Only 2.3% of crack offenders actually used a weapon. So the link between crack and violence was not as strong as a lot of people thought. So, and I just want to compare all of that information about sentencing for crack with, prior to the Drug Reform Act of 1986, the harshest sentence that Congress had ever imposed for drug use, any amount, any drug, was 1 year. Think of that. Prior to 1986, Congress thought 1 year was good enough. After 1986, lock them up for life. We have tens of thousands of people in prison convicted under those laws who are still there, and there's no retroactive forgiveness for that. They're still there, and they're going to languish there. They can't be let out unless there's an act of Congress to do that, because of this 1986 law.
Let me just pick up a little bit. It's 2019. The world has experienced some awful changes in the last probably 10 to 15 years. And some of it's because of the opioid situation we discussed. Some of it's because of the change in the legislature. Some of it's simply because we've abandoned to some degree the concept that locking up is the only solution. And you see that as in your involvement with criminal justice. Is that correct, Marc?
That locking up is not the only
Yeah, that we're seeing a sea change in the world of criminal justice.
I don't know if I'd go so far as to say sea change, but I do believe that there is a rethinking that's happening and a kind of self-assessment of criminal justice systems with an eye towards what the judge had mentioned earlier, this idea that, colorblind went from being a compliment to a concern. And so I do think that there is a reassessment happening within the criminal justice system, but I guess I'm not convinced that is showing any significant outputs yet, in the sense that I have not seen any data that's shown any dramatic differences in rates of sentencing or rates of arrest or rates of stop and frisk, for example, for people of color versus white people. It seems that there's a kind of philosophical theorizing about the idea of making things more equitable, but the actual on-the-ground law enforcement portion of the criminal justice system doesn't seem to be really responding in a systemic way. That isn't to say individuals such as, for example, the officer at the high school might not be making decisions on the basis of personal knowledge of someone's situation, and that it wouldn't do that person any good if they lock them up, for example. I think that does get back to another systemic change, shifting to some degree towards a community-oriented policing philosophy as opposed to a broken windows, tough on crime kind of philosophy where the solution was always catch them and put them away for as long as you legally can. And doing that in a way where the police forces tended to be people who did not live in the community, did not know the people in the community, therefore saw anybody who dressed a particular way or walked a particular way at a particular time of night as potentially suspicious, as worthy of stopping, questioning, frisking, arresting, etc. Community-oriented policing shifts that and tries to make the police integrated into the community, make police and community engagement a kind of commonality in the neighborhood so that police aren't only contacted when there's a problem. I live in Oshkosh, the Oshkosh Police Department. Cars say, know us before you need us. And I think that summarizes the philosophy of the community-oriented policing approach, which is know your officers, maybe don't befriend them, however you choose to know them is up to you, but at least that they're people trying to do a job, usually trying to do the best job that they can. And then on their side, knowing the neighborhood, knowing the community, knowing people who might be more likely to be committing problems, and the fact that the majority of the community most of the time is not causing problems. I want to get back to the culture piece too real quickly, to build off of what Kat said in particular, with some of the stuff with implicit bias and taking the time and committing yourself to unlearning so much of what we learn. And I wanted to step back a little bit and ask the question, how do we learn what we learn about, in my case as a white person, African Americans or other people of color? Like, how do I actually learn that? Coming from, in my case, a small, conservative, mostly white town. And I think it gets back to culture, but it gets back to the issue of ignorance and segregation and representation. So what I mean by that is that if I live in a place where I don't have any friends that look different from me, if I don't really know anything except what I see on TV, the question is, what do you see on TV? When I was growing up, my mom and my grandma, every Friday or whatever it was, would always watch Cops. And my mom loved cops. In fact, she was doing the Citizens Academy for like 15 years, so she loved cops. But what do you see on cops, right? It's a kind of racialized morality tale that gets played out weekly, where poor people of color are disproportionately stopped, and they're always guilty, or they have a kind of disclaimer that they're innocent until proven guilty, but the show kind of tells us otherwise. And so you see this sort of morality played out night after night on TV. You see the same thing in movies. And if that's all you know, because you don't have friends, you don't have conversations with people who are different from you, because you're residentially segregated and you're economically segregated as well, then you wind up just believing what you've seen on TV because it's the only thing you've ever seen about that particular population. Same thing goes oftentimes for what stories are reported in the news, for example, that if it bleeds, it leads, right? And so stories about violence on the south side of Chicago or in certain parts of Milwaukee or whatever tend to be front page, and so that reinforces this bias that we don't even know we're internalizing until we take a test like implicit association tests, for example. So I think that culture is a problem, but you have to get back to the question of what's represented in culture, and then one step behind that, you have to ask the question, who makes choices about what's represented in culture? Who is it that's actually deciding what's on TV? Because that's where the power lies in terms of shaping our perceptions of certain populations.
I want to pick that word representative really, really fast, because I'm going to ask this one to you, Carl Judge Ashley. In the state of Wisconsin, we elect all our judges, we elect our district attorneys, so we elect people that represent us. Kate mentioned, and Marc supported, that there's implicit bias. Is the system that we have, the democratic system we have in Wisconsin, and you've obviously experienced it several times running for office, is it a system that inherently supports this implicit bias? And how can we avoid democracy perpetuating this inherent bias that we seem to have?
Well, Steve, how do you become a circuit court judge? You are either appointed by the governor and then have to run 1 year after. There's 6-year terms. So I ran in 1999 and was elected and have run ever since. So that's 4 times I've ran since. I enjoy the opportunity to be on the bench. Is that the best methodology to get judges? Some people, some jurisdictions don't have elections, they're appointed. And then some don't have re-elections, they have merit, and they determine whether they're approved to continue or not. Of all those methods, I'm not necessarily opposed to the electoral process. It got me where I was. And I will have to tell you that in Milwaukee County back in the middle 1990s, there was a lawsuit in Milwaukee County where the NAACP said, look, we want to break up Milwaukee County into little districts so that would be a better likelihood of someone of color in that smaller district could get elected. That suit they lost, and NAACP lost that suit. One of the things that the proponents of not having that change was that a qualified African American could win. Right. And quite honestly, I'm probably on the bench because of that, because I was right there. And so some of those same people then supported me, but I think I was standing on the backs of people before me to get there. And so I don't know if appointment by like the governor would be the best thing. Depends, I guess. So how that process takes place, there are pluses and minuses, and I'm not necessarily at the point where I don't think the elected process isn't the best way to do it, but there are different options. I want to talk about that implicit bias test, because I'm going to say this, and I know I'm being taped and all of that, but I'm going to say it anyway. I took that test, and I failed. And so I said, something's wrong with that test. So I took that test again. fails. And I said, well, I got problems. But the reason I tell you that is this. The research also tells us that if you have implicit bias, and by the way, folks, we all do to some degree. We just do. It's not something we purposely do. It's implicit. It's just in there. It's baked in the cake. But what we know once you realize that is you can make better decisions because you're aware. And that's what we talk about with our colleagues. Yeah, folks, you may have it. It's like, did I catch it? It's something. What? But on a more serious note, we need to recognize our biases. And it helps us to be better judges, and it helps us to be fair about what we do every day. Because we make impact on people and families. When people come in front of me and I decide to send someone to prison, I'm not just sending that person, I'm affecting that family, that child, that brother, that uncle. When I send someone, and one of the highest statistics, determinants of whether someone's going to be successful is whether their parents are in jail or not. Because there are the statistics go off the chart that you're likely not to be successful or end up in jail yourself. So we really got to rethink, and this is what we're talking about. That's why I appreciate your comments about when we send someone to, I'll get back to it, but we incarcerate more people than anybody in the world. In the world. And don't get me wrong, some people, for public safety reasons, need to be incarcerated. Okay, look, I've had them and I'm like, yeah, you got to go. And I still ask that question, what made you do that? But public safety say, you got to go. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of people we're sending to prison don't need to go. And we need to have better resources in the community to support them doing positive things. That's the long-term success for us. Because it's very expensive to send someone to prison for a year. It's like $45,000. I think maybe you guys know the numbers, and maybe even higher than that. And you think about it. What? We're spending that much to send someone to prison? What could we do with that money? And what kind of services could we provide to that person and that family, which is much more likely to change that continuum of what's going on, breaking that cycle? And I'm going to turn it over.
I promised that I would turn this over to the audience. In fact, I've stretched that a little bit longer than. So, yeah, are there any questions that people want to ask?
Sure. Just to pick up on your last point about being a world leader in incarceration, I read an interesting book. It's called Locked In by John Pfaff, and I really recommend it because I was really curious about violent crime, which peaked in the early 1990s and actually has gone down substantially. Why don't we see this in the incarceration rates, right? And his response is, we don't talk enough about sort of the dark men behind the curtain, the prosecutors and their incentives. So, for as an example, an individual, as we know, a defendant can be charged with multiple counts of the same crime, right? So there is a lot of overcharging as an example, which then leads to plea bargains, and there's some issues, with that as well. And this is just one example, and this hits minorities, disproportionately. So I was wondering if you have any suggestions as far as prosecutorial reform, and in terms of what can be done to maybe change some of their incentives.
My good friend John Chisholm, RDA, has been a strong proponent of alternatives to incarceration. Deferred Prosecution would be a real quick study, a quick explanation of what that is. You get charged with an offense, you plead guilty to it, but it's held open, judgments are preserved. You do 6 months, you do what you're supposed to, it gets dismissed. Even before that, have diversions where people come into the court system and we don't want them in the system. And the research tells us low-risk people, we shouldn't be messing with them. We do harm by mixing low-risk people with high-risk people, because guess who's going to change their activity? When you put a low-risk person next to a high-risk person. So we've learned as a system, don't even let them in the door. I want to talk to you about District Attorney in Philadelphia, Larry Krasner. he was just elected recently, is making ways for his reform-minded approach to fixing some of the fundamental problems in our justice system. Among other innovative strategy, he's requiring prosecutors in his office to justify the cost of a prison sentence before asking the taxpayer to foot the bill. Now, it's kind of scary, right? But what he's saying, if, for example, it's $42,000 a year to put someone in prison, and you're recommending 5 years, that's $210,000. So tell us why you need to do that. Is there another way? And also now to incentivize some folks is to figure out, if we don't do that, can we get money back to folks to use it in an alternative way? So the reality is there are some methodologies available, and people are, now everybody ain't thrilled about what he's doing. But I think this group might understand that what we really want to do is change people's behavior. And if it's not a public safety issue, why send them to prison if we can monitor them and have better results?
Other questions? Yes.
So much of what you said seems to imply that the legislatures have a major role in this. Because if we have problems in housing or education or immigration or even criminal sentencing, a lot gets thrown back into the legislatures. And what we have seen in the last 8 or 9 years is that legislatures are deeply divided along political lines. And the word compromise or working together to find a solution is very, very hard. So that it seems that some of the things that you would support in the wider culture that affect the criminal system are going to be impossible unless we get legislators to collaborate with each other. So what do you do?
I want to let my colleagues also talk on that, but I just...
You're on.
Is that okay. I have to tell you, I talk to folks, do you know who your legislators are? Have you ever sent them an email? Do you go online? Because you can literally go online and have the information sent to you about pending legislation. So you could be one of those active members of our society who actually reach out. And you know what? There are separation of powers here. So we do have the judiciary, we do have the legislative branch. I can't get over there too much, and I'm not supposed to talk too much about some of that stuff because that's the legislative branch, and there is separation of power because we don't want them getting in our lane either. But the fact of the matter is we need more ability to understand what's going on. And so that the bigger, wider audience has an opportunity to understand. And you make those calls, don't you?
Yeah, your question makes me think about something that I've been knocking around in my mind since I've been looking into this, which is, so where do we go when we have an injustice? Do we go to the legislature? Do we go to mandatory minimum sentences? Do we go try to fix the judges? Do we try to fix the prosecutors? Do we try to change the incentives anywhere? And what I've eventually come around to is that there is no immaculate conception in law. All of the laws are made by human beings. We are human beings judging human beings. There's no getting around it, and there's no place, there's no locus of decision making that's free of the biases of us as human beings. We can't escape it. So the question is, what do we do? And I look at, for example, we found that we had terrible disparities in sentencing, and the mandatory minimums were intended, actually, to make it more fair. And what they did was they ended up being applied very, very heavily against black people and not against white people, so they made it worse. We took the locus away from what seemed to be unfair judges and prosecutors, and we put it on to Congress to fix it with mandatory minimum sentencing. That turned out to be a disaster. Now we're trying to take that back. So for example, the state of Florida recently passed a referendum to change their constitution. In the November election, they changed the Florida state constitution, or passed an amendment to take away the felony disenfranchisement, which was disenfranchising hundreds of thousands of Floridians. Once they had a felony conviction, they could never vote again. And because of really good work society-wide in trying to educate people about why this is a bad idea, and kind of unique in the developed world, so they passed this amendment. And it's kind of like, okay, direct democracy. They got it. They passed this amendment. Well, guess what? Now the Florida legislature is trying to add another piece to it. which was not part of the amendment that they passed. They're trying to add a piece which says, well, you can only register to vote if you paid all your fines and all your legal fees, which is really a tax on poverty. It's really basically saying, if you are poor, you still can't vote. That's not what Floridians passed, but the legislature's trying to do it. I don't see that there's any place we can go to escape the biases that we have, and I don't see that there's any way we can escape doing the work we need to do of becoming a society that confronts its biases, confronts its fears, confronts its brokenness on issues of race. And I think that work is starting to be done. The fact that, for example, The New Jim Crow, the book by Michelle Alexander, sparked this incredible national debate, really fed this whole conversation. The fact that we're even here today is because of Michelle Alexander, I think. And that's hopeful. That is a piece of progress, but boy, do we have a long way to go because there's 7,000 more people in Ripon who are not here today.
Yeah, go ahead, Marc.
Yeah, I was just going to speak to it briefly. You know, as I was listening to both of the other panelists talking, I guess I started to think about this in terms of a cost versus a benefit. So especially as a political science professor, thinking in terms of constituencies that you're appealing to. You know, the benefit for the longest time, you could go back however far you wanted to, but you could argue late 60s, early 70s, the tough on crime, you know, law and order platform of Richard Nixon could be argued as maybe the kind of predecessor of this long-standing now half-century of being lambasted anytime you let someone off for a reduced sentence, particularly if you're, you know, letting off someone who then reoffends in some sort of violent, terrible way. That's essentially a, you know, political suicide if that happens to you, such as Michael Dukakis in 1988, the whole Willie Horton ad infamously from George H.W. Bush. So for the longest time, the benefit has been to at least represent yourself in terms of a political branding as tough on crime, as standing up for the good people against the bad people, talking in euphemistic or other ways about things like welfare queens or other things like this, which, you know, racially coded language to get yourself elected and reelected. And to get back to something that Kat mentioned about the disenfranchisement of people with felony convictions and this new amendment in Florida is attempting to push back, that then gets to the cost of being tough on crime or positioning yourself that way. Because if this is successful in Florida, you're bringing a whole new pool of people into the voting population. And once that pool reaches a critical mass, they have a certain amount of control over what politicians need to say, hopefully what they do once they're elected. And they can kind of shift the discourse, they can shift the conversation, and maybe they can put some pressure on legislation in ways that will benefit people who have gone through the system and been convicted of a felony, which, as we've already talked about tonight, disproportionately affects the poor and people of color. And so, you know, if we start to re-enfranchise some of these populations who have served their time, you know, bring people back into the system, I think that would be a place to start, maybe at least in terms of making politicians question whether it's a good political move to continue to be quote unquote tough on crime when you have a whole new pool of people that have not benefited from the tough on crime policies of the last decades.
I'm going to steal a second that a moderator should never steal, but I want your comment on this one because it goes back to your question. There was a time when district attorneys and judges didn't have minimum or maximum sentences, and you could teach or treat the people as people, and you didn't have to worry about these maximum minimums. Do you believe, from your experience as a judge and what you've seen from the district attorneys, not just in Milwaukee County, because I know you've seen it beyond the Milwaukee County world, that most judges and most, let's say, seasoned district attorney employees, I won't say the people that run for office, but the ones that are doing the work, that if they're left to their own vices, they generally will, if well educated, provide a degree of tolerance and understanding?
I think that in Milwaukee County, it's probably like 140 DAs in John's office. And there are certain of those DAs who believe in being a little bit more progressive on looking at sentencings and recommendations. There just are. Some will even call the defense attorney and say, hey, why don't you refer that case over for a DPA? Or why don't you refer that case over to drug treatment court? Because I think we're going to get a better outcome. There are certainly those there, and I think that's a good sea change. That's a good sea change. Doesn't hit everybody though, and that's the issue. So I am encouraged. So look, doom and gloom, guys. I don't want you to walk out of here and don't think there's been some progress made. There has been, and there is potential for much more progress to be made, so that they're not outliers who want to do this, but folks who say, you know what? I'm not being soft on crime. I'm just saying the likelihood of a better result with money and for that family is this way. Not because I'm soft on crime, but that other stuff. It's just that it's meaningful. I'm not going to get the kind of result that the community really needs. And that's the sea change. The people are actually trying to figure out, well, you know what? That's just not working. I want to try something different. And there are a number of ADAs, and John Chisholm's one of them from the leader down. But I have to tell you, the deputy DA, one of the deputy DAs is very involved in this, really pushes this stuff, but he runs into blocks. Some of the DAs are a little like, well, I don't know if I want to do that. So it's work to be done, but there's progress. So I want to leave on enough note.
Other questions? Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Truth in sentencing. Sentencing guidelines. Could you address those? Your feeling about that, Judge? And
all right, truth in sentencing. The idea is that you're supposed to serve. Well, it's bifurcated sentences. Your first is the actual time you're going to serve, and then the second part is basically it's what used to be called parole. Okay, and so when that all happened, we thought that was going to be a good thing. The problem with this, what happened with that is, judges are sentencing people to a certain amount of in-prison time, but they're putting these long, extended supervisions on. So I'm going to send you to prison for 4 years, and I'm going to keep you on extended supervision for 8 years. Well, one of the biggest reasons to get people back in prison are they're being, and I know you guys know this, they're being revoked. And we're trying to look at that system because no one anticipated that those resources be committed for that long a period of time. And so we have to kind of rethink that. I mean, I think it was done with as was said, there was some reason to believe it was maybe a good thing, but not exactly turning out that way. And we kind of need to rethink that a little bit. I know you both have some information on that. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Steve. You're the judge.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to mention the Federal Sentencing Guideline Commission, because they were the ones who came up with the 1986 law. And then they saw what it did. They looked at it and they're, oh wow, oh this is much worse than we thought. They did some research on it, they collected some data, and they went back to Congress and they said, we want to change this. We want to, these crack and powder cocaine disparities, this is not right. They tried to change it, Congress turned them down. They tried to change it again, Congress turned them down. They tried to change it again, Congress turned them down. 3 times. Finally, they got Congress to look at it again, and they got Obama to sign somewhat of a change into law in 2010. It turned the disparity from 100 to 1 crack versus powder to 18 to 1. That this would count as a triumph is kind of depressing, but it's better. And what I would say about the Sentencing Commission, now I don't know the makeup of that commission, I don't know exactly how that gets put together, but although it's popular to bash government institutions right now as irredeemably flawed and incompetent and all that, I do think we need to invest in institutions that show some sense of progress and promise. And I do think that Sentencing Commission learned some lessons over the years. I think they started paying attention and making more data-based decisions. I don't know if they're still like that. I don't know if they've been replaced by people who are really ideologues who don't want to look at the data. But if they have been, I mean, if it's had some longevity, I would want to look into that as a place for further progress, and have a commission with some institutional memory that could hopefully make increasingly wise decisions, database decisions.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Just somewhat on the topic that we've been talking about most recently. I believe in 2018, even our dysfunctional federal Congress, House and Senate, were able to agree on some, again, there's difference of opinion about how significant, but it's known as the First Step Act. And I wonder if any of you had a chance to look at that. It is pretty new, but I think it's a recognition by both, not all of course, but by quite a few Republicans as well as Democrats, that we are incarcerating way too many people. 655 out of 100,000 are incarcerated, and as the judge pointed out, it's extremely expensive. Canada, 114 per 100,000. Germany, 76 per 100,000. Japan, 41 per 100,000. The ratios are unbelievable. So I think there is some recognition that that's very costly to our society to have all that human capital basically being wasted. I hate to put it in such a crass manner, but that is how people, do in Congress do tend to look at it. So is this First Step Act, is this at all encouraging, or is this too little too late?
Go ahead, Kate.
I think it is a first step, and I agree it's progress. It's a bipartisan bill to curb the harshest mandatory minimum sentences. The cool thing about it, actually, is that it was passed with bipartisan support and Trump signed it. People who are afraid of being kind of out-Trumped, who feel like they need cover to vote for some easing of the harsh mandatory minimums, they have cover. Trump signed this. He approved of it as well. I think this is a great moment. I think this is an unusual bipartisan moment for change here. I would say there's a really important addition that needs to happen to it, which is that it needs to be made retroactive, because there are thousands of people in prison right now who are still locked up for crimes that they would not be locked up for nearly as long if they were sentenced now. So that's a change that needs to happen, and it hasn't yet.
And all about the marijuana thing too. Wait to see what the legislature will do on that in light of what's happening across this country, and the impact that has on people's lives. I could talk to you for a long time, but I know Steve is not going to.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to very briefly build off of this, I think another point to make about the progress, bipartisan progress that was actually made at the federal level, which is pretty astounding, is that we're also living in the context of this opioid crisis, and that has affected from coast to coast, Republican districts, Democratic districts, all sorts of people. I'm sure, I'm not going to ask, but I'm sure if I asked for a show of hands in this room, people who have been directly or indirectly affected by it, it would be a significant proportion of this room. As such, the opiate crisis has been so endemic that it is not a partisan thing, per se. And so if we were living 30 years in the past, I doubt that we would have gotten the First Steps Act, because it was a racialized narrative. We were talking about this in terms of the bad people in the city and the good people in the suburbs. That's not the case anymore. And so I guess to get to another silver lining of the crisis that we're living through right now, it's that it could perhaps lead to some federal legislation and state level legislation that might make things a bit more equitable and could be a first step.
The one thing I'd add, and we'll move on, is you really have to know that the legal profession, despite what some of the rumors might be, is fighting for sentencing reform. The American Bar Association current president has a commission that has worked on that. There's been literally hundreds of thousands of dollars every year spent by lawyers to try to remedy the problem. I know a lot of people suggest that it's lawyers that are the problem, and judges are the problem, and DAs are the problem. And I always remark that, well, we can't operate on our own. We have to get hired. We have to get elected. We're part of society, but we really do expend a lot of time and money trying to bring more social, diverse justice, because guess what? It makes our job a whole lot easier and a lot more effective. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Does the privatization of prisons have any role in the disparities in the justice system?
I'll tell you, at least there are still jurisdictions that use it. It's scary because it's you want to. Did I turn it off again?
Yep.
Okay, sorry. We realize that profit motive doesn't necessarily provide the best incubator for people in custody. And if it's motivated by just profit, but that's business. So does it create a problem? I have concerns about it. Certainly moving people to accommodate the business aspect instead of having people closer to their families so that they can continue with those relationships. I think it's very problematic, but it's the money issue. Kate?
Yeah, I'd like to add a couple things to that. One is that the for-profit prisons have been used particularly for immigrant detention, and they're very widespread there, and they're actually, we have a certain number of beds, I believe it's 340,000 beds that, according to ICE, need to be filled, since they're paying for them. So there's a push to have always enough immigrants in detention that you can fill all those beds. And if you look at the prospectuses from these companies that run these prisons, they have in their perspective it's not only the immigration detention ones, this is for-profit prisons in general. They'll say in their prospectus that the high rate of recidivism makes this an excellent investment. Do we want to think of it that way? Is that helpful? And I think the abuses in the private prisons have been extreme to the point where I know ICE has closed some down. They've been so bad, but they also won't let people in. I know that Dade County, for example, has been trying to, by law, if they have children in detention, they have to provide education. They will not allow the Dade County School Board they won't let them in. So they can't see if that's going on. They can't see if the law is being upheld. So there's a lot of abuses in the private system.
You will find that private prisons are just about economically dead in the United States. Everyone we've had in Wisconsin is either closed or being closed. They really have, despite what they may tell you about the profitability, they have no profitability. If you don't believe that, go to Stanley someday and take a look at it. Mark, you had a comment?
Yeah, I was just actually sort of going to build off that. I do think that the for-profit prison system is problematic. That being said, most people who are in prison are not in for-profit prisons, right? And so if we're talking about a systemic problem, for-profit prisons are a small and apparently diminishing percentage of our overall imprisoned population. Of course, there's another population that aren't in prison at all. They're in jail. And then we've got the other issue that the judge mentioned earlier of longer and longer probation sentences and things like that, which feeds right into the recidivism piece. The longer that you are under supervision of one sort or another, the more likely it is that you're probably going to commit something that puts you back into the system. Meaning that if, for example, we take the current model that we have, you get out of prison, jail, whatever, you went in, let's say, for a drug offense. It was either selling or manufacturing something which was probably motivated primarily by your economic circumstances, or had something to do with consumption and addiction and things like that. You haven't received any economic benefits while you're in the system because you didn't really receive any formal educational training or job training. And if you were an addict going in, you probably received little, if any, effort to rehabilitate you and get you some sort of treatment that you need, let alone set you up with something outside of the system once you're actually released. And so you're essentially released into a situation where your job prospects are very low, so you don't have any more training than you had when you went in, and now you've got a felony on your record, on your job application. You don't have any more education than you had before you went in. You're not going to be able to get federal loans if you want to try to go off to college, and on and on and on. And so you're setting people up for a situation where they look around and they say, well, what's left for me? No one will hire me, I can't go to school, I can't afford anything. So what am I going to do to get by? So I'll steal some things, or I'll get back in with the only people that I know that are making money in my neighborhood, which is the people that are selling drugs or doing something else that's illegal. Lo and behold, you wind up caught back in the system with another conviction on your record. The other aspect of this too is that if you're taking disproportionately poor people and putting them into a system and then keeping them under surveillance for an extended period of time, if they do have a broken tail light or they run a red light or something, then they're locked in the system through fines because they can't pay the fines for low-level offenses that people commit every day on their way to work or something like that. And so now they're stuck having violated their probation for something that they can't pay off. And so then they're stuck in a kind of debtor's prison of sorts. So,
well, we've hit the magic hour. I'm going to give everybody 2 minutes to tell me how you're going to solve this problem. Now I'll start with you, Marc.
All right.
And I'm going to time you.
Okay. So I have 2 pages here. So let's see, a minute per page.
Which will be available for publication.
A lot of this we've touched upon already in our prior conversation. I think one of the things that we didn't touch upon a lot that I mentioned on my notes here is changing the way that schools are funded. In that, as I mentioned before, the funding through local property taxes, but also this kind of this mentality that we have that schools that are quote unquote failing to thrive will be defunded at a federal level and closed are, of course, usually the schools that are suffering economically already. And so thinking about ways that we can change the local property tax structure of funding for schools, but also changing the way we think about federal and state level funding of schools, and actually investing in the schools that need the money most, rather than simply basing it on local property taxes or things which tend to benefit the rich and damage further the poor. And I say that because, as an educator, education is one of the ways that people get hope, and they get some sort of training, and they possibly get a way out of the situation that they were born into. And so I would see that as one possible systemic change. I also think, what we're doing today, helping people think more structurally, think more historically, understanding that crime isn't an individualized issue. It's not a bad person. It's a system that created situations where a person committed something. And so thinking systemically and historically and understanding the history of the country and where we're coming from. And I guess I'll say one more thing.
15 seconds.
Okay. There's a movement called Ban the Box, which is about removing the box about a felony conviction on a job application. I think there's a lot of merit in that idea because it stigmatizes people and makes it very, very difficult for them to actually get back into the job market.
Thank you very much. Kate?
Okay, I'm going to start with Native American issues. The first thing is that I think we need to get our Native American law, our whole system of jurisprudence, in line with the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, which the US did finally sign on to. We have a long way to go, but not all tribal law should be abandoned, so it's going to be some fancy footwork, I think, to align our current law with that, and it will mean overturning some precedents that are quite painful and ugly. I also think we need to rethink the purpose of prison and jail sentences. I would like to think that the purpose is public safety and chipping away at the problems that gave rise to the criminal behavior in the first place. In terms of public safety, long sentences have very quickly diminishing returns. A lot of people age out of criminal behavior long before they age out of prison or long before they get released. So we have a lot of older people in prison who are really pose no danger to society. I used to work in the Oxford prison occasionally as sort of on a mildly chaplainish basis, and not Oxford, Red Granite. And there were a lot of old folks in there who, frankly, I would not be the least bit troubled to meet them in a dark alley somewhere. I don't think they pose a danger. We're spending a lot of money to keep them locked up. We also could do a lot better while people are in prison with giving them something useful. I have a cousin who spent 9 years in prison in Alaska, which at least had well-funded prisons when they had lots of oil money. And he got an education, he got useful skills, he has been out of trouble and living a productive, self-supporting, quiet life ever since. A lot more people could get what he got. I wish they did. I also would like to reduce immediately eliminate the disparities between crack and powder cocaine, make that stuff retroactive. I would like to make life without parole very rare. If that's a very rigid sentence, we could reduce the years of misery by simply eliminating that for a lot of people. About half the people who have that sentence are black, and they're people who would not have been sentenced to that if they had been white. They make a very disproportionate number of people who have life without parole. So I think it should become extremely rare and only used to protect public safety. I would like to abolish it for minors and for nonviolent crimes.
I would like the 15-second rule on you too.
I would also like to present to Congress the evidence of racial disparities, because the judges are still going on their precedents that they will not overturn a decision based on massive evidence of racial disparities. They won't do it because they say that's not what we do in court. Present that data to Congress. We need to get Congress to work on it. The courts will not. Their precedents don't allow them.
Thank you very much. Now I get to tell the judge you only have 2 minutes.
Well, I tell you, I'm going to take my time just to thank you for coming. I appreciate the opportunity to learn from my colleagues on the panel, and hope that you will take some of this and be able to spread it, talk a little bit more about it. One thing I do want to talk about is expungement. I think that we alluded to it a little bit. There is some legislation pending on expungement, and what does that mean? Up to the 2 lowest felonies, you have an opportunity. It used to be that the judge had to do it at the time. Now they're opening it up a lot, and I can't tell you how many people I've met in the community who have a conviction, and it's the only thing they've done, and they can't get jobs. The collateral consequences are so significant, and you know how we're supposed to be a society of second chances. I'm not talking about somebody who's been a criminal and back and forth. I'm talking about someone who just made a mistake. All right? And they want to go on with their life and support their family, and that mark on them creates so much havoc and limits their ability to do the good things we want them to do. So if you hear about expungement, take a look at it, see if you can support it. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, and I'm going to turn it back to Ollie, because I know he wants to wrap this up. But I want to personally thank the panel for everything you've said, and hopefully everyone gets to come and talk to them afterwards. Thanks.
I know it took a little longer, but so thanks for being patient. So I would like to grant special thanks to Steve Sorensen from moderating the panel, and also special thanks for distinguished guests to take time out from their busy schedule. So thanks to the audience and all the people who came. Thanks for the Center for Politics and People, the Next International, Field of Society, and the Meritocracy for making this event a reality. So if you members of the audience have any questions, you can ask in person to the panelists. So thanks for listening. Have a safe trip home, and have a great day.